Black Hills, Dakota Territory, September 1877. While every homesteader rushed to salt and cure their autumn meat harvest before winter, Norwegian immigrant Lars Eriksen was building a smokehouse that his neighbors called a frozen meat failure, waiting to happen. His design defied every principle of frontier meat preservation, where experienced settlers positioned their smokehouses 6 to 10 feet from fire pits. Eriksen was digging a trench that would place his 40 feet away. Where proven methods demanded temperatures between 150 and 180 degrees to cook meat into preservation, Eriksen's underground flue system would maintain a cool 65 to 85 degrees. Most troubling to the settlement's established meat cures, Eriksen planned to use almost no salt in a process that everyone knew required 15 to 20% salt saturation to prevent deadly spoilage. Henry Morrison watched Eriksen work from across the clearing, shaking his head at what he considered structural insanity. Morrison had spent 8 years perfecting German salt curing methods that his grandfather had brought from Bavaria, techniques that had preserved meat for 3 generations of his family. He'd never lost a harvest to spoilage, never poisoned a family member, never deviated from the proven formula of heavy salt and proper storage. What Eriksen was attempting seemed designed to fail. Morrison approached Eriksen's construction site on a cool September morning, his boots crunching through early frost. The Norwegian was on his knees, using a measuring cord to mark precise angles for his underground flue. Behind him, his 14-year-old son Jacob recorded measurements in a leather-bound notebook, writing in a mixture of Norwegian and English that documented every specification of their unconventional design. "Meat needs salt or heat to preserve," Morrison called out, watching Eriksen position stones for the flue entrance. "You're using neither properly. You'll poison your family by Christmas." Morrison had seen inexperienced settlers try to economize on salt before, watched them lose entire autumn harvests to green mold and rancid fat by February. He considered it his duty to warn Eriksen before the Norwegian wasted his season's slaughter on an experiment that defied frontier logic. Eriksen didn't look up from his measurements. His weathered hands, scarred by 15 years of North Sea fishing work, adjusted the cord until it formed a perfectly straight line from fire pit to smokehouse location. "In Norge, we preserved cod for year-long voyages without heavy salt," he replied in his thick Scandinavian accent. "Cold smoke penetrates deep, kills what makes meat rot, keeps texture soft. Your salt method pulls water out too fast, makes meat like wood." Frank Dobbs arrived at the site that afternoon, carrying the professional authority of a man who'd built 23 smokehouses across 3 territories since 1872. Dobbs had earned respect as the region's meat smoking expert, and he found Eriksen's design troubling on multiple levels. The excavation showed a flue that would extend 40 feet underground, 18 inches deep, lined with native stone that Eriksen claimed would cool smoke from 400 degrees at the fire to 75 degrees at the meat chamber. The smokehouse itself measured 12 by 8 feet with a 9-foot ceiling, featuring ventilation gaps of exactly 3 inches at floor level and at the roof peak. Most disturbing was the wood selection. Eriksen had stockpiled exclusively apple, cherry, and hickory in what he claimed was a crucial 2-to-1-to-1 ratio, while every practical builder knew you used whatever hardwood was available. Man's wasting near 40 feet of trench digging and months of construction time, Dobbs told Morrison and Ole Hansen that evening at the settlement's informal gathering. Scandinavian fishing techniques don't translate to frontier meat preservation. He'll have rot by Thanksgiving and no salt backup to save his family's protein supply. Ole Hansen, a fellow Norwegian who'd immigrated 5 years earlier, had abandoned old country methods for proven American salt curing. He approached Eriksen with concern that mixed cultural loyalty with practical frontier sense. "Lars, I know the Norwegian ways, but this is Dakota Territory, not Bergen. Winter here kills families who experiment with food preservation. Use salt like the Americans. Don't risk your children on methods that worked for fish, but might fail for pork and beef." Eriksen continued his construction undeterred by the community's skepticism. Each morning, he and Jacob selected stones from the creek bed, choosing pieces based on thermal properties that Jacob was learning to identify by weight and texture. The Norwegian tradition demanded specific stone qualities, density, and grain structure that would absorb and radiate heat evenly throughout the smokehouse's interior. While neighbors built their smokehouses in 3 days using standard patterns, Eriksen spent 2 weeks carefully angling each stone in the underground flue to create the precise temperature gradient his design required. By late October, Eriksen had completed his smokehouse, while neighbors finished their salt curing preparations. Morrison had invested $18 in salt for his autumn harvest, packing pork and beef in barrels with the 15% saturation his German methods required. Dobbs had processed 23 families' meat using his proven hot smoke methods, 3-day cycles at 160 degrees that dried and darkened meat into shelf-stable products guaranteed for 4 to 6 months. Eriksen had slaughtered 2 hogs, yielding 340 pounds of meat, 1 beef, providing 180 pounds, and 12 chickens, all of which would hang in his cool smokehouse for 6 weeks of continuous cold smoking, at temperatures his neighbors considered dangerously inadequate for preservation. The economic stakes were substantial and unforgiving. Autumn slaughter represented 8 months of protein for frontier families operating on subsistence margins. Salt cost $12 per 100 pounds, a significant expense that Morrison accepted as necessary insurance against starvation. Meat spoilage meant potential death by malnutrition or expensive winter purchases from traveling butchers who charged premium prices. If Eriksen's experiment failed, his family had no salt backup and faced a protein shortage that could prove fatal before spring gardens produced. Morrison calculated his investment while watching smoke begin rising from Eriksen's distant fire pit. $18 in salt, 3 weeks of curing labor, storage space in his root cellar, and the confidence of 8 years' experience. Eriksen had invested nothing in salt, but had spent $40 in construction materials and 5 weeks of building time that could have been used preparing firewood or winterizing his cabin. The Norwegian's meat hung in pale, cool smoke that would continue for 6 weeks, while Morrison sat safely packed in salt barrels, following methods that had preserved meat for 3 generations of German families. Let's see how Lars's sideways contraption works when real cold hits, Morrison told Dobbs as the first snow began falling that evening. Light flakes that promised the testing season ahead, when Eriksen's refusal to follow proven American methods would either vindicate Norwegian tradition or condemn his family to hunger in the unforgiving Dakota winter. November brought the first cold snaps to the Black Hills, and with them came the daily speculation about when Eriksen's unsalted meat would begin its inevitable decay. Henry Morrison's salt-cured hams completed their standard 3-week cure right on schedule, emerging from their salt pack with the characteristic hard, darkened exterior that signaled proper preservation. His bacon finished hot smoking in 4 days, dried and shelf-stable in the root cellar, where Morrison stored it alongside pork packed in salt barrels. He'd invested his $18 and 3 weeks of labor, and the results matched 8 years of reliable experience. His meat would last the expected 6 months, maybe stretching to early spring if his family rationed carefully through the lean months. Frank Dobbs finished processing meat for 23 families using his proven hot smoke methods, maintaining the professional standards that had built his reputation across 3 territories. Each family's harvest spent 3 days in smoke cycles at 160 to 180 degrees, the heat cooking and drying meat into the dark, hardened state that everyone recognized as properly preserved. Dobbs calculated that each family had consumed approximately 1.5 cords of wood in the smoking process, achieving preservation that would carry them 4 to 6 months before requiring summer meat purchases from traveling butchers. Across the settlement clearing, Eriksen's smokehouse continued, producing the thin, pale smoke that neighbors found suspiciously inadequate. His meat remained hanging for the full 6 weeks, requiring daily fire tending to maintain the constant 70 to 75-degree temperature that seemed far too cool for actual preservation. Morrison noticed that Eriksen was burning significantly more wood than standard methods required, approximately 2.2 cords through the extended smoking period. The economics seemed backwards. Eriksen was spending more on fuel to achieve results that looked half-finished, meat that retained a pale, supple appearance instead of the dried-out look that signaled proper smoke penetration. Morrison's wife, Catherine, mentioned something odd in early December while preparing their salt pork for Sunday dinner. The meat required longer cooking than she remembered from previous years, and even after hours of simmering, it remained tough and fibrous. She'd soaked it overnight to draw out excess salt, following the standard preparation her mother had taught her. But the texture seemed wrong somehow. Across the settlement, Ola Hansen's family complained at their dinner table about the overwhelming saltiness of their preserved meat, how it required 2 full days of soaking before it became palatable, and even then left everyone thirsty and reaching for water throughout the evening. At Thanksgiving, the Eriksen family served chicken that had been hanging in the smokehouse for 8 weeks. Morrison and several curious neighbors had been invited, and what they witnessed troubled their understanding of meat preservation. The chicken looked almost fresh, with moist, tender meat that pulled easily from the bone. The smoke flavor was present but subtle, nothing like the heavy, almost acrid taste of hot-smoked meat. Morrison tasted it skeptically, expecting the slightest hint of spoilage, some off flavor that would validate his warnings. Instead, he found himself chewing chicken that was more tender and flavorful than his own fresh-smoked poultry from October. It seemed impossible. Meat this moist, this supple, should have rotted weeks ago in Eriksen's cool smokehouse. William Chester, a younger settler who'd built his cabin just last spring, found himself genuinely curious about Eriksen's methods, despite the community's skepticism. He approached the Norwegian after Thanksgiving dinner, asking technical questions about the underground flue system and temperature control. Eriksen explained patiently, demonstrating how cold smoke penetrated deeper into meat without cooking the surface, how slow moisture loss preserved texture while still creating the antimicrobial environment necessary for long-term storage. Salt draws water out too fast, Eriksen said, running his hand along the smokehouse's interior wall, where moisture levels stayed consistently around 68%. Makes meat hard and dry. Slow smoke preserves while keeping meat soft, like it should be. Chester found the explanation fascinating, but admitted his doubts. Science don't mean it works come spring, he told Eriksen. Morrison's methods are proven. Yours might make sense in theory, but theory don't feed families when meat rots in February. Jakob's detailed logs showed data that would have surprised the settlement if anyone had examined them closely. The smokehouse maintained 68% humidity, while Morrison's root cellar averaged 35%. Temperature readings stayed within a 2-degree range day and night, the underground flue system providing thermal stability that above-ground storage couldn't match. Smoke density measurements, recorded through a system Jakob had devised using light penetration, showed consistent antimicrobial compound presence throughout the meat chamber. But these were Norwegian record-keeping methods, written half in a language the settlement couldn't read, documenting principles that contradicted frontier, conventional wisdom. Frank Dobbs visited Eriksen's smokehouse in early December, 5 weeks into the smoking process. His professional eye examined the construction details he'd dismissed as overcomplicated in September. The underground flue created airflow patterns he'd never considered in his 23 previous smokehouses. The ventilation gaps produced cross breezes that prevented the stagnant air pockets where bacteria thrived in traditional designs. The wood selection, that specific 2-to-1-to-1 ratio of apple to cherry to hickory, produced smoke with a complexity Dobbs had never achieved with his grab whatever hardwood is available approach. If this works, Dobbs admitted to Eriksen quietly, Then I've been doing it wrong for 8 years. But he added quickly, before his professional pride completely crumbled, spoilage will hit by February when you rely on it most. Cool smoke don't kill what needs killing for long-term storage. The settlement's women began expressing concerns to Ingrid Eriksen about feeding her children meat that looked questionable by frontier standards. Several suggested that it wasn't too late to salt cure properly, that Lars could still salvage the harvest before winter truly set in and made his mistake fatal. The social pressure intensified through December as temperatures dropped and the reality of winter isolation approached. Families who made mistakes with food preservation didn't get second chances on the frontier. Children died from tainted meat, from protein shortages, from parents who'd gambled on unproven methods and lost. By Christmas, Morrison's family had consumed 40% of their salt pork, the hard, over-preserved meat requiring hours of soaking before it could be cooked into something approaching edible. His calculations showed they were burning through their supply faster than expected, the excessive saltiness making it less appealing and harder to prepare, leading to larger portions being discarded as too tough or too salty for consumption. Meanwhile, Eriksen's family ate tender, flavorful ham that neighbors assumed would be rotten by New Year's. The contrast was visible at the Christmas gathering, where Morrison's contribution required apologetic explanation about proper soaking technique, while Eriksen's smoked pork was consumed enthusiastically by everyone who overcame their skepticism long enough to taste it. The real test would come in spring, Morrison told himself, when standard preservation methods reached their natural limits, and Eriksen's meat was supposed to be long spoiled and dangerous. 6 months was the proven timeline for salt-cured and hot-smoked meat. Whatever was happening in Eriksen's cool smokehouse, whatever temporary success the Norwegian was experiencing, couldn't possibly survive past March, when temperatures rose and storage conditions challenged every preservation method the frontier had ever known. March 15, 1878. Henry Morrison opened his root cellar to discover what every frontier family feared: the unmistakable smell of meat turning rancid despite salt preservation. The odor hit him immediately, that sickly sweet scent of protein decay that no amount of salt could mask once it started. He pulled out the first barrel and found green mold creeping across the salt crust that was supposed to protect his family's food supply. Beneath the surface, his hams showed the telltale slime that meant bacterial growth had won its battle against preservation. Morrison stood in his cellar calculating losses that made his stomach turn. 85 pounds of meat gone bad, over $12 of value spoiled, and his family facing a protein shortage with 3 months until summer gardens could produce. Within a week, 7 families across the settlement reported similar catastrophic failures. Frank Dobbs found himself investigating a problem that shouldn't exist according to his 8 years of professional experience. Standard methods should work, he told Morrison while examining the spoiled meat. Something's different this year. The culprit became clear as March temperatures climbed to 65 degrees for 8 straight days, unusually warm conditions that pushed salt-cured meat beyond its preservation limits. In root cellars that couldn't maintain consistent cool temperatures, the salt concentration dropped as moisture increased. Hot smoked meat fared no better, the excessive drying having oxidized fat that now turned rancid and inedible. Ole Hansen's hybrid approach, mixing Norwegian and American techniques, produced the worst results of all. He'd used less salt than Morrison, but more than Eriksen, hot smoked at lower temperatures than Dobbs, but higher than true cold smoking. The combination gave him insufficient salt preservation and inadequate heat treatment, a failure of both methods that cost him 90% of his autumn harvest. Hansen's family of 6 now faced genuine malnutrition risk with 2 months of winter remaining and no protein reserves to sustain them through spring planting season. When Eriksen opened his smokehouse in late March, 6 months after slaughter, Morrison witnessed something that challenged everything he'd learned in 8 years of meat curing. The meat hung exactly as it had at Christmas, with a dry surface coating that felt firm to the touch and showed a deep mahogany color from months of smoke exposure. Morrison watched Eriksen cut into a ham, revealing interior meat that looked fresh, with proper pink color and moist texture that shouldn't exist after half a year of storage. There was no off odor, no hint of the sourness that preceded spoilage, no signs of the fat oxidation that had destroyed hot smoked meat throughout the settlement. The surface showed what Eriksen called a pellicle, a protective coating formed by smoke compounds and controlled moisture loss that created a barrier against bacterial invasion. Morrison asked the question that had been building since Thanksgiving. How does this work when everything I know says it shouldn't? Eriksen invited him into the smokehouse, explaining principles that Morrison had never considered in his German salt curing tradition. Salt pulls water out fast, but leaves meat vulnerable when the salt concentration drops in humid storage, Eriksen said, gesturing to the failed barrels Morrison had just discarded. Hot smoke cooks the meat surface, sealing in moisture where bacteria breed underneath. Cold smoke with controlled airflow creates a stable environment where slow moisture loss and smoke compounds work together. The meat dries gradually, stays protected continuously. Jakob's logs provided the mathematical proof that Morrison's practical experience couldn't deny. Morrison's method achieved 6 months maximum preservation with 35% meat loss to trimming and spoilage, plus the $18 salt investment. Dobbs's hot smoking preserved meat 4 to 5 months but dried it excessively, removing 45% of moisture that made it tough and prone to fat rancidity. Eriksen's cold smoking showed 8 months of confirmed preservation with only 18% moisture loss, 0 spoilage, no salt cost, and meat quality that exceeded fresh smoked texture and flavor. The community's desperation peaked as late winter protein shortage hit hardest. Gardens wouldn't produce for months, wild game was scarce after a hard winter, and families who'd lost meat to spoilage faced genuine hunger. Morrison approached Eriksen with a humility that cost him considerable pride. My family needs protein and I have none left that's safe to eat. Can I purchase some of yours? Eriksen's response surprised the settlement. He gave meat freely, 30 pounds to Morrison's family, 20 pounds to the Hansons, smaller amounts to 3 other families facing shortages. This is how we survived in Norge, Eriksen explained. When someone's preservation worked and another's failed, you shared. Next year might reverse and you'd need their help. Frank Dobbs experienced his own professional crisis as reports arrived from the 23 families he'd serviced. Nearly all were experiencing similar preservation failures. Meat that should have lasted through spring, now spoiled or dangerously close to turning. His reputation had been built on methods that were proving inferior when tested against extended storage and variable conditions. Dobbs approached Eriksen with the directness of a craftsman who recognized superior technique. Teach me, he said simply. I've been doing this wrong and people are suffering for my ignorance. On April 3rd, Eriksen demonstrated his meat's quality by cooking a ham for a gathering of skeptical neighbors. The meat was more tender than fresh pork, with a complex smoke flavor that had developed over 6 months of curing. There was no excessive salt requiring hours of soaking, no tough dried texture from hot smoking, no hint of spoilage that would make it dangerous. Morrison tasted it and performed calculations that shamed him. If I'd built it Eriksen's way last autumn, I'd have saved $18 in salt, $12 in spoilage loss, and my family wouldn't have gone hungry in March. The math was undeniable and humbling. As April brought spring rains and warmer temperatures that destroyed the last surviving traditionally preserved meat across the settlement, Eriksen's smokehouse still held 180 pounds of perfect protein. 7 months after slaughter, his meat remained safe and delicious, while his neighbors rationed what little they had left or purchased expensive fresh meat from traveling butchers. The Norwegians' method was no longer considered foolish or risky. It had become essential knowledge for survival. But the ultimate test still approached. Summer heat would prove whether Eriksen's meat could truly last through the full year to the next autumn slaughter, completing a preservation cycle that every frontier expert insisted was impossible without ice houses or continuous heavy salting. June 21st, 1878, the summer solstice brought temperatures that reached 94 degrees in the Black Hills. Every remaining piece of spring-preserved meat across Dakota Territory had been consumed or discarded by late May. Standard wisdom held that no meat survived summer without ice houses or continuous salting. Yet in one smokehouse 40 feet from a carefully maintained fire, hams and bacon still hung 9 months after slaughter. The settlement watched with a mixture of hope and morbid curiosity, waiting to see when Eriksen's impossible preservation would finally fail under conditions that defeated every known method. Henry Morrison found himself purchasing fresh meat weekly from traveling butchers at premium prices, 18 cents per pound, compared to 8 cents in autumn. His family ate more beans and less protein, adjusting to the reality that his traditional methods had failed completely by April. The root cellar, that once held barrels of salt pork, now stood empty except for spring vegetables. Morrison calculated his losses through the summer months, $35 spent on fresh meat purchases that his autumn preservation should have prevented. He watched Eriksen's continued success with the fascination of a craftsman who discovered his fundamental techniques were flawed. Eriksen adapted his management techniques for summer conditions with the same precision he'd applied to construction. The underground flue system, 18 inches deep in earth, that stayed between 60 and 65 degrees regardless of surface temperatures, now provided critical cooling that kept the smokehouse at 72 to 75 degrees, while external air reached the 90s. He reduced fire frequency from daily burning to every 3 days, maintaining just enough smoke density for continued preservation without adding unnecessary heat. The ventilation gaps, originally set at 3 inches, were adjusted to 2 inches to compensate for stronger summer breezes that threatened to overdry the meat. Jakob's measurements showed consistent internal air movement at 2 to 3 miles per hour, enough to prevent stagnant conditions, where bacteria thrived, but not so much that moisture loss accelerated beyond the optimal range. Frank Dobbs committed to Eriksen's methods with the determination of a professional rebuilding his reputation. He constructed 3 experimental smokehouses using Eriksen's exact specifications: underground flues extending 35 to 40 feet, stone-lined channels that cooled smoke before it reached the meat chambers, precise ventilation calculations that controlled airflow. He purchased expensive off-season pork in June to test the technique, investing his own money to prove whether the method worked or whether Eriksen's success was somehow unique to his particular setup. The community watched Dobbs' conversion with interest. If the region's recognized expert was adopting Norwegian methods, perhaps there was genuine substance behind the technique. Ole Hansen approached Eriksen in early July with an admission that cost him considerable cultural pride. "I abandoned Norwegian methods because I thought American ways were better. I was wrong." Hansen had lost his autumn harvest to spoilage while dismissing the very techniques his own grandfather had used in Bergen. The reconciliation went beyond personal preservation failure. It represented a broader frontier assumption that Old World knowledge was primitive and inferior to American innovation. Eriksen's response carried no judgment or triumph. "Old country knowledge has value when it solves real problems," he told Hansen. "Doesn't matter if it's Norwegian or American, old or new, it matters if it works." On July 15th, 10 months after slaughter, Eriksen conducted a public demonstration that would define the technique's credibility. He cut into a ham that had hung through autumn, winter, spring, and now summer, revealing interior meat that retained its rose-pink color and firm texture. The aroma showed complex smoke character, with no hint of the sourness that preceded decay. He cooked a portion for the gathered settlers, and Morrison tasted meat that was more tender and flavorful than fresh smoked pork he'd prepared just weeks earlier. "This is better than my fresh meat from last month," Morrison admitted, the words spoken quietly but heard by everyone present. Eriksen explained the science, as he understood it from Norwegian tradition. Smoke contains over 200 compounds, phenols and carbonyls and acids, that each preserve differently. Cold smoke lets these penetrate fully, without cooking the protein structure. Temperature control prevents bacteria growth below 80 degrees, while avoiding the cooking that happens above 100 degrees. Continuous low-level smoking maintains an antimicrobial surface environment that standard methods can't achieve. Salt-free preservation means no moisture is forcibly extracted, so the meat self-regulates its moisture content naturally. August brought the ultimate test as temperatures reached 96 to 98 degrees for a 10-day stretch. Morrison had predicted that if Eriksen's meat survived August, it would survive anything. The settlement formed informal betting pools on whether the preservation would finally fail under conditions that seemed designed to defeat any non-refrigerated storage method. On August 8th, Eriksen noticed slight surface moisture on one ham, the first sign of potential trouble in the 11 months. He responded immediately, increasing smoke frequency to every 2 days and adjusting ventilation to increase airflow by 20%. Within 3 days, the surface had returned to its proper dry pellicle state, demonstrating that the method required monitoring and adjustment rather than passive storage. As August's heat broke and September's cool air arrived, Lars Eriksen opened his smokehouse to reveal what no frontier family believed possible: 220 pounds of perfectly preserved meat, 12 months after slaughter without salt, still safe and delicious. He'd completed the full-year preservation cycle that experts insisted required ice houses or commercial facilities. Morrison stood in the smokehouse examining pork that had been hanging since the previous September, running his hands along meat that showed no signs of spoilage, no dangerous bacteria growth, no quality degradation that would make it unsafe or unpalatable. The mathematical reality was undeniable. Eriksen had preserved 580 pounds of meat through a complete year with a 97.4% yield. Morrison's traditional method had achieved 59% yield over 6 months before total failure. The economic difference was stark. Eriksen had spent $8.40 on wood and $0 on salt. Morrison had spent $18 on salt, $4.50 on wood, and $35 on summer fresh meat purchases. The cost comparison showed a $44 advantage to Eriksen's method, a fortune for frontier families operating on subsistence budgets. Word of the year-long preservation spread rapidly through Dakota Territory and beyond. 12 families visited Eriksen's operation in September, examining the smokehouse construction, asking detailed questions about temperature control and wood selection, requesting consultation on building their own cold smoking facilities. Eriksen began supplementing his income with design fees, $3 to $5 per consultation, helping neighbors implement techniques that would transform their food security. The Norwegian secret was becoming essential frontier knowledge, spreading through communities where meat preservation meant the difference between comfortable survival and desperate hunger. September 12, 1878. Henry Morrison stood in Lars Eriksen's smokehouse, examining pork that had hung there for exactly 1 year. Morrison had just slaughtered his autumn hogs using traditional methods, and the irony cut deep. He was beginning another preservation cycle using techniques he now knew were fundamentally flawed, while Eriksen's year-old meat hung beside him in perfect condition, proof that everything Morrison had learned over 8 years was inferior to knowledge he'd dismissed as primitive Scandinavian folklore. At the settlement gathering 3 days later, Morrison did something that frontier pride rarely allowed. He stood before the community and admitted professional failure. "I've cured meat for 8 years, using German salt methods passed down 3 generations," he announced, his voice steady despite the humiliation. Lars Eriksen's Norwegian technique is superior in every measurable way. Morrison listed his method's failures with the precision of a man who'd done the calculations repeatedly. Higher cost, 25% spoilage rate, tough texture, 6-month maximum preservation. Then, he made his commitment public. I'm building a cold smokehouse, using Lars's design before winter. I won't waste another season doing it wrong, when the right way has been proven. The construction boom that followed transformed the settlement's landscape. 18 families began building Eriksen-style smokehouses through September and October, digging 40-foot trenches for underground flues, calculating precise ventilation gaps, stockpiling apple and cherry and hickory wood in the specific ratios Eriksen had demonstrated. Frank Dobbs officially abandoned hot smoke methods, offering cold smoke consultation services to families who wanted professional help implementing the new technique. Ole Hansen became Eriksen's construction partner, the two Norwegians working together to help neighbors build systems that would prevent the starvation and spoilage that had devastated the previous winter. Jakob's complete data documentation provided the mathematical foundation that convinced even the most skeptical builders. Eriksen's year-long results showed 580 pounds of meat processed with zero spoilage, only 15 pounds lost to trimming, a 97.4% usable yield after 12 months. Morrison's traditional method, reconstructed from his careful records, showed 380 pounds processed with 95 pounds spoiled, 60 pounds lost to excessive trimming, and complete depletion after 6 months. The economic comparison was even more damning. Eriksen had spent $8.40 on wood with no salt cost. Morrison had spent $18 on salt, $4.50 on wood, and $35 additional dollars purchasing summer meat after his preservation failed. The total difference was $44.60, money that represented weeks of labor for frontier families. The technique spread beyond the immediate settlement through networks of communication that connected immigrant communities across 3 territories. Eriksen's cousin Robert, settled near Asheville, received detailed construction drawings and material specifications through October correspondence. The documents included flue depth calculations adjusted for different soil types, wood ratio variations for regions where apple or cherry was scarce, and scaling designs for families ranging from 3 to 12 people. By late 1878, Norwegian communities in Minnesota and Wisconsin were sharing similar cold smoking knowledge, creating a regional movement that validated traditional preservation techniques against American hot smoking and heavy salting methods. Morrison's reconstruction project became a public demonstration of professional transformation. He tore down his wall-mounted smokehouse in early October, salvaging usable stone while discarding everything that represented his flawed approach. With Eriksen's consultation, he built an underground flue extending 42 feet from fire pit to meat chamber, stone-lined and graded for optimal smoke cooling. The smokehouse measured 12 by 8 feet, with the precise 3-inch ventilation gaps at floor and roof peak that created cross-ventilation without excessive drying. Morrison invested in proper wood, 2 cords of apple, 1 cord of cherry, half a cord of hickory, maintaining the ratio that produced smoke with the antimicrobial properties necessary for year-long preservation. His first cold smoke cycle began in October 1878, and by March 1879, Morrison experienced results that vindicated his decision to abandon tradition. Zero spoilage, meat texture superior to anything he'd achieved with salt curing, and his family's first taste of year-long preservation that didn't require purchasing expensive summer meat. Morrison's wife, Catherine, noticed the difference immediately. The meat cooked tender without hours of soaking, had complex flavor without overwhelming saltiness, and stayed moist through preparation methods that would have left salt-cured pork dry and tough. Frank Dobbs rebuilt all 23 smokehouses in his service area between autumn 1878 and spring 1879, creating standardized design specifications that could be adapted to different family sizes and regional conditions. He charged $5 per consultation training apprentices in cold smoking techniques that required understanding of thermodynamics and airflow management beyond the simple heat and time calculations of hot smoking. By spring 1879, Dobbs had supervised construction of 47 smokehouses using Eriksen principles, and his professional reputation had been rebuilt on the foundation of admitting error and learning better methods. Ola Hansen reflected on his journey from cultural abandonment to reconciliation. I thought abandoning Norwegian ways meant becoming American, he told Eriksen, while helping construct a smokehouse for the Patterson family. I was wrong. Eriksen's response captured the philosophical transformation happening across the settlement. Being American means taking the best knowledge from everywhere, he said. Tradition has value when it solves real problems. Doesn't matter if it's old or new, Norwegian or American, it matters if it works. Winter 1878 to 1879 provided the first large-scale test of widespread cold smoking adoption. 18 families using the new method experienced zero meat spoilage through the cold months. 3 families still using traditional methods lost significant portions of their harvest to the same spring warming that had devastated Morrison's meat the previous year. The settlement's collective meat preservation success represented over 8,000 pounds of protein saved from spoilage, approximately $3,500 in combined salt and spoilage cost reduction, and the elimination of late winter protein shortages that had been accepted as inevitable frontier hardship. By spring 1879, Lars Eriksen's secret had preserved meat across 3 territories, saved families thousands of dollars in combined costs, and transformed how frontier Americans thought about food preservation. The technique's impact extended beyond individual economics into cultural recognition that dismissing traditional knowledge as primitive often revealed not their ignorance, but frontier arrogance. Sometimes the most advanced solution was remembering what worked before settlers forgot to listen to the generations who'd solved these problems centuries earlier in conditions equally harsh and unforgiving. By 1882, the Black Hills region had become known across Dakota Territory, not for gold strikes, but for meat preservation. Lars Eriksen's Norwegian cold smoking technique had spread through over 200 homesteads, and the man once mocked for his secret method was now consulted by territorial agricultural extension agents and commercial meat processors, seeking to improve their preservation quality. Salt imports to the region had dropped 40% compared to 1877 levels, representing thousands of dollars in savings for families operating on subsistence margins. Average household preservation costs had decreased $30 to $45 annually, while nutrition outcomes improved dramatically through year-round protein availability that territorial health surveys documented in their reports. Commercial applications emerged as deadwood meat processors adopted cold smoking for premium products that commanded 20% price premiums over standard preserved meat. Rapid City butchers began advertising Norwegian-style preserved meats, and railroad expansion brought Dakota cold-smoked products to eastern markets, where quality reputation established Black Hills meat as a recognized brand. What had begun as one immigrant's refusal to abandon traditional knowledge had become a regional industry built on techniques that frontier experts had initially dismissed as backward and impractical. Henry Morrison experienced the most dramatic personal transformation, becoming a regional cold smoking advocate who taught the technique to over 30 families annually. He partnered with Eriksen in a consultation business that provided income while spreading knowledge that prevented the spoilage and starvation Morrison had witnessed during his 8 years of using inferior methods. At settlement gatherings and regional meetings, Morrison spoke with the conviction of a convert. I wasted 8 years doing it wrong because I thought traditional methods were primitive, he told audiences across 3 territories. I learned that old doesn't mean obsolete. It often means proven through centuries of testing that our frontier arrogance dismissed without examination. Eriksen and Morrison collaborated to document regional variations and adaptations that extended the technique's applicability beyond the specific Black Hills conditions. They mapped wood alternatives for areas where apple and cherry were unavailable, calculated altitude adjustments for smoke density at different elevations, and created flue depth specifications for various soil types. Size scaling designs accommodated families from 3 to 12 members, ensuring that the preservation method worked across the economic spectrum of frontier settlement. The documentation represented a synthesis of Norwegian tradition and American frontier innovation, taking Old World knowledge and adapting it systematically to New World conditions. The techniques spread through Scottish immigrant networks into Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina, where mountain communities faced similar preservation challenges with limited salt access and harsh seasonal temperature variations. By late 1885, over 450 cold smokehouses operated across the broader Appalachian and Great Plains regions. The Dakota Territory Agricultural Report of 1884 estimated that these facilities preserved 75,000 pounds of meat annually, saved families over $6,000 in combined salt and spoilage costs, and reduced average spoilage from 25% under traditional methods to 3% under cold smoking protocols. Preservation duration extended from a 5-month average to consistent 12-month cycles, eliminating the late winter protein shortages that had killed vulnerable settlers during previous harsh seasons. The cultural shift that Eriksen's success catalyzed went deeper than preservation techniques. Frontier communities began actively documenting Norwegian, German, and Swedish traditional knowledge, instead of assuming that American methods were automatically superior. Regional knowledge-sharing gatherings brought together immigrants from different backgrounds to compare techniques for everything from well digging to roof construction to food storage. Eriksen's statement at one such gathering captured the philosophical transformation. My grandfather preserved cod in Bergen using these principles for 300 years before I was born. I just adapted them to Dakota pork. Knowledge crosses oceans. When we're humble enough to listen to the people who solved problems we're still struggling with. Scientific validation arrived when University of Minnesota agricultural researchers studied Eriksen's technique in 1886, documenting the antimicrobial properties of specific wood smoke compounds and measuring the temperature and humidity relationships that prevented bacterial growth while maintaining meat quality. Their published research confirmed that cold smoking at 65 to 85 degrees with proper smoke density created environments hostile to pathogenic bacteria while allowing beneficial chemical changes that enhanced flavor and texture. The academic paper, titled Norwegian Cold Smoking Techniques in American Meat Preservation, provided scientific explanation for empirical methods that had worked for centuries before anyone understood the underlying microbiology. Modern validation came through USDA food safety studies conducted between the 1970s and 1990s, which confirmed that smoke compounds, including phenols and carbonyls, provided genuine antimicrobial protection when applied through cold smoking protocols. Slow moisture loss in the 15 to 20% range prevented bacterial growth while maintaining the texture that made preserved meat palatable and nutritious. Eriksen's empirical methods, developed through trial and observation over generations of Norwegian fishermen and farmers, aligned perfectly with contemporary food science, understanding of preservation chemistry, and microbiology. The culinary renaissance of the 2000s brought renewed interest in traditional cold smoking as the charcuterie movement rediscovered techniques that industrial food production had abandoned in favor of refrigeration and chemical preservatives. Premium restaurants featured Norwegian-style cold-smoked meats that commanded high prices, and artisanal food producers recognized that traditional methods produce superior flavor, texture, and shelf life compared to modern industrial preservation. What frontier Americans had once called primitive was now celebrated as sophisticated craft knowledge that anticipated modern understanding of food chemistry by centuries. Eriksen's original smokehouse site in the Black Hills was designated a historical landmark by the South Dakota Historical Society in 1992. Jacob's original temperature and humidity logs preserved in state archives, provided researchers with detailed documentation of 19th century preservation techniques that informed contemporary understanding of traditional food systems. Educational displays at the site explained how one immigrant's refusal to abandon traditional knowledge had transformed regional food security and challenged assumptions about the superiority of modern methods over ancestral wisdom. In 1895, at age 72, Lars Eriksen reflected on the journey from mockery to validation. Neighbors called my smokehouse a secret, but it was never secret. Norwegians had used these methods for 300 years before I built mine in Dakota. The only secret was their willingness to believe old knowledge might be obsolete simply because it came from people they considered backward. I didn't invent anything. I just remembered what my grandfather taught me and refused to abandon it because Americans did things differently. Between 1877 and 1895, over 600 families adopted the technique across Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming territories. These facilities preserved over 500,000 pounds of meat annually by 1895, generating $50,000 in annual economic savings through reduced salt costs and eliminated spoilage. Thermal engineering analysis suggests the technique prevented 15 to 20 deaths from malnutrition and food poisoning that traditional methods would have caused during particularly harsh winters. Lars Eriksen's secret smokehouse didn't just preserve meat for a year without salt. It preserved something more valuable, the wisdom that dismissing traditional knowledge as primitive often reveals not their ignorance, but our arrogance.